You've heard of Moses parting the Red Sea, but do you know the mysterious woman who saved his life before the Exodus? Her name was Zipporah, and her story will shock you. When death came for Moses, Zipporah stepped forward with a knife and did something no one expected. She defied tradition and saved a prophet. After one of the Bible's most dramatic moments, Zipporah suddenly disappears.
Why?
What happened to Moses' first wife, and why is no one talking about her? If you love Jesus or are fascinated by hidden stories in the Bible, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a mystery like Zipporah's again. Zipporah was the daughter of Jethro, a priest of Midian. She wasn't Hebrew. She was a foreigner, raised in the desert. Yet God chose her to become the wife of Moses, the man who would lead Israel. Moses fled Egypt and found Zipporah when he defended her and her sisters at a well. Jethro welcomed him into the family, and Moses took Zipporah as his wife in a land far from Pharaoh's wrath. Zipporah wasn't an Israelite. Her marriage to Moses stirred questions even back then. But God used her, showing that his plan wasn't bound by race or nation. Zipporah became part of divine destiny. Zipporah bore Moses 2 sons, Gershom and Eleazar. While Moses prepared to lead a nation, she raised a family. Her quiet strength stood beside a man burdened with God's call. When God called Moses to return to Egypt, Zipporah went with him. But on that journey, something strange happened, a deadly encounter with God that only she could stop. God nearly struck Moses dead on the way to Egypt, but Zipporah saved him by circumcising their son herself. It was a shocking act, but it honored the covenant Moses had neglected. Zipporah took a flint knife, circumcised her son, and touched Moses' feet with the blood. It was radical, shocking, but it saved his life. She obeyed when Moses hesitated. After the act, Zipporah cried out, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me." Her words echoed pain, sacrifice, and a strange loyalty. She gave up comfort to honor God's covenant. After this intense moment, Zipporah disappears for a time. Many believe she returned to her father Jethro, while Moses continued to Egypt alone. The mission had separated them. Later, Jethro brings Zipporah and her sons to reunite with Moses at Mount Sinai. It's a quiet moment of reconnection, after storms, distance, and divine calling. After that, Zipporah disappears from the story. No death is recorded. No legacy is written. Yet she saved Moses, raised his children, and walked with him into destiny, quietly, faithfully. Even after Sinai, Zipporah remained mostly unseen. She wasn't part of Moses' public leadership. She stayed in the background, supporting, raising their sons, walking in silence. As Moses led Israel through the wilderness, Zipporah likely endured the hardships too: desert heat, food shortages, constant movement. She was part of the journey, even if her name wasn't. Later, Moses' sister Miriam criticized him for marrying a Cushite woman, and many believe that woman was Zipporah. Was there tension in the family? Jealousy? The Bible hints at it. God didn't tolerate Miriam's insult. He struck her with leprosy and defended Moses' wife. Zipporah may have been quiet, but heaven noticed her. God honors the hidden and faithful. Zipporah never led an army, performed miracles, or spoke on a mountain. But she was chosen by God to walk beside the prophet of deliverance. Her legacy is quiet, but essential. While Moses stood before Pharaoh, parted seas, and climbed Mount Sinai, Zipporah remained mostly unseen. Yet her role as the prophet's wife was sacred. She carried the emotional weight he couldn't show. She raised their children, guarded their tent, and lived between miracles and wilderness. Her silence didn't mean insignificance. It meant strength. In the Bible, not all heroes speak, some just stay and support. Zipporah did what many couldn't: walk beside a man burdened by God and not break. Zipporah was not called by the burning bush. She wasn't given signs or plagues. She didn't speak to God face to face. Yet she stayed. When Moses was gone for weeks on Sinai, she waited. When the people murmured and moved through barren lands, she endured. Hers was a quiet, relentless faith, one that didn't need the spotlight. Her trust wasn't just in Moses, but in the God who called him. In every step through the dust, she proved that faithfulness isn't always loud sometimes. It just keeps walking. Raising children is hard, but imagine raising them in the wilderness, under tents, with no city, no schools, and a husband constantly leading millions. That was Zipporah's task. She mothered the sons of Moses in a world filled with danger, divine fire, and rebellion. Her children didn't grow up in a palace like Moses did. They grew up in dust and holy fire. We don't hear her voice, but her impact echoes through her children. She carried legacy in silence, while the world watched her husband. Zipporah was a Midianite, not a Hebrew. She stepped into a people with different customs, faith rhythms, and history. It couldn't have been easy. The whispers, the judgments, the outsider glances, yet she stayed. God's story is full of outsiders becoming insiders. Ruth was a Moabite. Rahab was from Jericho. Zipporah stood in that same lineage of foreign women brought into God's plan. Her presence reminded Israel, God's promise isn't just about bloodlines. It's about belief. And she believed enough to leave her home and follow God's call through Moses. Zipporah isn't quoted in long speeches. She's not listed in Hebrews 11. She fades from the story quietly. But that doesn't mean she wasn't important. Many of God's greatest servants go unrecognized. Zipporah wasn't forgotten by God, only by man. She reminds us that true faith doesn't always get applause. It holds the line when no one's looking. It sacrifices in silence. And in a story filled with fire, thunder, and miracles, God chose her to save the prophet's life. That alone speaks volumes. The Bible never records Moses saying, "I love you," to Zipporah. But love in Scripture isn't just about words. It's about loyalty, sacrifice, and shared burden. Moses chose her in exile. He welcomed her back at Sinai. And when others questioned her worth, Moses remained silent. Not to abandon her, but perhaps to shield her. Their marriage wasn't spotlighted, but it survived trials most couples couldn't. In a world of plagues, prophecy, and pressure, their bond quietly endured. Gershom and Eleazar, sons of Moses and Zipporah, aren't major figures in the Bible. They didn't become priests or prophets. But their existence meant something. They carried the bloodline of deliverance and the legacy of a woman who defied death to save their father. They were raised in tents, saw the plagues from afar, and watched their mother walk a narrow, quiet path of strength. Zipporah may not have shaped nations, but she shaped sons, and that may have mattered just as much. Zipporah's inclusion in the story of Moses is no accident. She was a Midianite, a woman outside the covenant people, yet God placed her beside Israel's greatest prophet. Like Rahab and Ruth, her life testifies that faith, not bloodline, draws us near to God. She wasn't chosen by men. She wasn't invited by Israel. But God used her to fulfill his purpose, even when the chosen people rejected her. Her life is proof that outsiders have a place in God's inner story. As Israel built the tabernacle and followed the cloud by day and fire by night, Zipporah likely remained quietly with the community, one of thousands in a wandering people. But she was different. She had seen Moses before the miracles, in his exile, in his weakness, and in his calling. She knew the man behind the miracles. While the people revered Moses, Zipporah remembered him as a husband and father. She grounded him. And perhaps, in the sacred silence of the wilderness, she worshipped too, in her own quiet way. As Moses' mission expanded, Zipporah's presence faded. She wasn't at the Red Sea crossing. She didn't receive the commandments. She wasn't consulted before the laws were written. For many women, that absence would feel like rejection, but Zipporah didn't rebel. Her story shows us the quiet ache of obedience. Sometimes, those who walk with greatness are called to fade behind it. And even when the world forgets their names, God remembers their faith. Unlike Sarah, Rebecca, or Rachel, Zipporah was never called a matriarch of Israel. She didn't lead a tribe or become a symbol of motherhood. But maybe that wasn't her calling. She was placed beside Moses not to be remembered through lineage, but through loyalty. While the patriarchs shaped a nation's history, Zipporah helped sustain its deliverer. She may not be honored in genealogy, but in the hidden history of faith, she remains unforgettable to those who truly look. Zipporah was from Midian, a place once linked to Abraham through Keturah. Her father Jethro, a priest of Midian, would later bless Moses and offer wisdom to Israel's leaders. Through Zipporah, the bridge between Midian and Israel was strengthened. She carried more than a marriage. She carried the connection of two ancient peoples. Her life reminds us that God sometimes unites old family lines in unexpected ways and builds his plan through relationships that others might reject. It's possible that Zipporah faced harsh words, skeptical looks, and even rejection from Moses' own people. She was foreign. She was bold. She had stepped into a role others didn't understand. But she stayed. She bore the pain of being misunderstood without walking away from the mission. That kind of strength doesn't scream or fight. It stays faithful when it's easier to run. In every era, there are women like Zipporah, unseen pillars holding up destinies greater than their own. Zipporah may not have spoken to God like Moses did, but she clearly understood the importance of covenant. Her decision to circumcise her son, alone and urgently, shows spiritual boldness. She took initiative in a divine matter that Moses himself had delayed. That moment revealed a glimpse of the fire within her, a woman who understood enough of God's holiness to act. In one act of obedience, she preserved the prophet's life and fulfilled what law had required. Before the wilderness journey began, before the 10 Commandments were given, before Israel crossed the Red Sea, there was Zipporah. She stood beside Moses before the miracles, before the fame, and before the fire. She knew him when he was a fugitive, not a leader. That kind of history shapes a bond deeper than most. She wasn't just a wife in the wilderness. She was the woman who stood at the very beginning of the Exodus story. And without her, it may never have begun at all. While Moses received the law from God, Zipporah remained in the background. She didn't see the thunder or hear the voice on Mount Sinai, but she felt its weight. Every new law changed how the people lived, and Zipporah, though not an Israelite by birth, had to adapt too. She was the first foreign woman to live under the law given through her own husband. Her faith wasn't rooted in spectacle, but in quiet submission to God's unfolding plan, even when she wasn't center stage. Jethro, Zipporah's father, came to visit Moses and offered wise counsel on leadership. But we often forget that wisdom came through her. She was the bridge between the prophet and the priest. Without Zipporah, Jethro may never have spoken into Israel's structure. Through her, generations of people benefited. Her influence wasn't loud. It was relational, practical, and deeply embedded in legacy. She didn't just follow God's plan. She enabled others to shape it more wisely. Zipporah never speaks again after the moment at the inn, yet her actions echo through time. God doesn't always highlight voices. Sometimes he highlights obedience. Her silence wasn't punishment, it was preservation. She fulfilled her role, then stepped back so Moses could lead. But in the heavenly story, the one that sees hearts, Zipporah is honored. She saved a prophet. She raised a family. She lived under the weight of law and covenant. Her silence was not weakness. It was strength. Zipporah's sons, Gershom and Eleazar, disappear from the narrative. Some believe they never held power in Israel. But what if their legacy was meant to be different? Maybe their purpose wasn't leadership, but remembrance. Every time they looked at Moses, they saw a leader. Every time they looked at Zipporah, they saw faith. They carried a story no one else could, of a woman who bled to save a prophet, who stood between heaven and death, and never demanded recognition. After Sinai, Zipporah fades from scripture. No burial is recorded. No farewell is written. But sometimes, the most beautiful flowers bloom in the desert and vanish quietly. Zipporah didn't need an ending written in stone. Her life was carved into the memory of deliverance. She may be forgotten by men, but heaven never forgets those who walk faithfully in the background. In the great symphony of salvation, she played a quiet note, but it still echoes through time. Throughout Moses' journey, Zipporah was never meant to be the one standing at the front of the crowd. God had chosen Moses to lead Israel, to perform miracles, to deliver commandments. But what about the one who stayed beside the leader? What about the one who never heard the voice from the bush, but believed anyway? Zipporah's story reminds us that some people are not called to the spotlight, they are called to carry those who are. She supported a nation's prophet, raised his sons, and submitted to a plan far bigger than herself. That is not a lesser calling. That is holy service. Being married to a man like Moses wasn't easy. He was constantly torn between his duty to the people and his responsibility to his family. Zipporah often stood in the tension, watching him leave for the mountain, for the tent of meeting, for endless gatherings with the elders. She raised their sons without him at times, managed camp life, and still honored the God he served. To love a man chosen by God sometimes means giving him up for a greater purpose. And Zipporah did that not just once, but over and over again. Zipporah lived between two identities, born Midianite, married into the Hebrew people. She likely felt the tension of never fully belonging to either. To the Hebrews, she was a foreigner. To the Midianites, she had chosen another path. Yet God saw her faith, not her ethnicity. He used her as part of his redemptive story, proving once again that faith, not heritage, determines who plays a role in his plan. Zipporah stood between two worlds and chose the one that honored God, even when it came at the cost of her comfort and cultural roots. We often wonder, did Zipporah ever regret marrying Moses? She left her homeland, lived through plagues, wandered the wilderness, and watched her husband consumed by a mission that left little time for her. But there is no biblical record of her complaining. No lament. No outburst. Her silence may be one of the greatest testimonies of grace in Scripture. She bore the weight of loneliness, displacement, and sacrifice. Yet she stayed. That kind of perseverance isn't passive. It's a decision, every day, to love without conditions. A decision that changes history quietly. History remembers warriors with swords, prophets with staffs, and kings with crowns. But Zipporah was a warrior of a different kind. She battled doubt, displacement, and silence. She won no visible victories, but every day she woke up and chose obedience. That kind of warrior doesn't get praised in songs, but heaven knows their name. Zipporah fought battles no one saw and endured wounds that left no scars. She reminds us that in God's kingdom, invisible faithfulness is more powerful than visible fame. In a story filled with grand miracles, towering mountains, and seas that part, it's easy to overlook someone like Zipporah. She's not loud. She's not famous. She doesn't lead crowds or challenge kings. But in the quiet of her life, God saw her. And sometimes, that's the most powerful truth, that the God of the universe notices the ones no one else applauds. Zipporah reminds us that heaven celebrates more than boldness. It honors those who stay faithful when no one is watching. She may not be a heroine to the world, but in God's eyes, she was never invisible. Being married to destiny doesn't always feel glorious. For Zipporah, every moment with Moses meant standing in the shadow of something eternal. She loved a man who belonged more to God's mission than to her. That's a hard place to live, caught between personal love and public purpose. But Zipporah never stood in the way. She embraced her place, not as the spotlight, but as the anchor. Behind every great mission, there's often someone unseen, holding everything together in the background. That was Zipporah, the silent thread in a divine tapestry. Zipporah walked between two extremes, the divine fire that surrounded Moses and the raw, human struggle of motherhood, loneliness, and cultural rejection. She was close to God's power, but far from the attention it brought. She circumcised her son with trembling hands while angels looked on. She raised boys in a wilderness touched by God's glory, but filled with dust and fatigue. Her feet were blistered, her heart was stretched, but she never turned back. Her life teaches us that real faith isn't polished. It's raw, worn, and willing to keep going. The Bible doesn't tell us how Zipporah died. There's no farewell scene, no final words. Her name fades from the text, but not from the impact. Sometimes the most faithful characters are buried quietly, yet heaven never forgets their labor. Zipporah carried the covenant when no one else could. She guarded the life of the prophet, raised his children, and stood in the wilderness long after others would have quit. The world may forget her name, but the God of Israel never did. And neither should we. When we think of the Exodus, we think of Moses, Pharaoh, plagues, and parted seas. But behind the miracles stood a woman, strong, quiet, obedient. Zipporah never stood before Pharaoh. She never raised a staff, but she raised the man who did. She shaped him in exile, believed in him when he doubted, and risked everything to protect his calling. Without her, there may have never been an Exodus, as we know it. In a world desperate for spotlight heroes, God reminds us through Zipporah that silent strength is still strength. Zipporah didn't receive a heavenly vision. She didn't see God in a burning bush or hear him thunder from Sinai. But when the moment came to act, when Moses' life was in danger, she didn't ask questions. She obeyed. That kind of faith is rare. Most of us want clarity, signs, or full understanding before we move. But Zipporah acted on instinct, belief, and covenant. She did what even Moses hesitated to do. Sometimes, the greatest measure of faith isn't knowledge, it's obedience in the dark. Out of all the people God could have used in that moment, he chose Zipporah. Not an angel, not Aaron, not even Moses. It was Zipporah who stepped in, understood the seriousness, and performed the covenant act that saved her husband.
Why?
Because she was ready, spiritually alert even without grand signs. God chose her because he knew she would move when others froze. Sometimes, God uses the ones no one expects because they're the only ones listening when it matters most. Zipporah lived on the edge of holy ground. Her tent wasn't in the Holy of Holies, but it was near the man who spoke face to face with God. That proximity came with tension. Holiness isn't comfortable. It reveals, refines, and often isolates. She bore the burden of living near divine fire without being consumed by it. She wasn't chosen to lead Israel, but she was chosen to carry the one who would. That calling required sacrifice, and Zipporah walked that line faithfully. Zipporah's name may not be shouted from pulpits or sung in psalms, but her legacy whispers to every generation, you don't need to be center stage to matter in God's story. You don't need a title to change history. Faithfulness, especially when it's unseen, still shakes the foundations of heaven. Zipporah teaches us that obedience matters more than visibility. That quiet courage, the kind that loves, acts, and endures in silence, is what heaven celebrates. And in her story, we see the strength of a woman who didn't need to be remembered, to be essential. The Bible doesn't record Zipporah's death. There's no burial, no mourning, no closing words. But maybe that was intentional. Her life wasn't meant to end with a grand farewell. It was meant to echo quietly into eternity. Like many unsung heroes of Scripture, her story reminds us that God often moves most powerfully through those who finish well in silence. Zipporah's absence at the end is not a loss, it's an invitation. To live like she did, obedient in obscurity, faithful to the end. Without Zipporah's quick action to circumcise her son, Moses would have died. And if Moses had died that night, who would have stood before Pharaoh? Who would have led Israel out of Egypt? Zipporah didn't just save her husband, she preserved the entire future of the Hebrew people. That single act, done in urgency and fear, was the turning point between death and destiny. Sometimes, it's the hidden choices, the painful, private moments, that secure the public miracles. Zipporah's obedience didn't just save a man, it protected the entire bloodline of redemption. Zipporah's life represents a divine bridge between Abraham's ancient promises and the birth of a new nation. She wasn't born into the covenant, but she was grafted into it by faith and obedience. Like Ruth and Rahab after her, she stood in the gap, showing that God's story was never just about bloodlines, it was about belief. She carried Abraham's legacy forward by preserving Moses' life and shaping his family. In a world divided by lineage, Zipporah was proof that grace reaches across borders. It's easy to think God only uses loud, bold, outspoken leaders, people who stand on stages or confront kings. But Zipporah proves otherwise. She wasn't known for speeches or miracles. She didn't challenge Pharaoh or gather crowds. But her quiet courage was the foundation that history stood on. She said less, but did more. She didn't need a spotlight to serve God's purpose. Heaven often chooses quiet women for loud callings, because strength doesn't need to shout, it just needs to endure. Long before Miriam sang songs of deliverance, and before the women of Israel danced by the sea, Zipporah had already paid a price. She had left her home, stood between Moses and death, and raised a family in the wilderness. She was the first woman to truly feel the cost of being bound to a prophet's mission. And yet she didn't run. She accepted that loving Moses meant carrying a burden most would never understand. Her story is the silent blueprint for every woman who ever loved a man with a divine calling. We don't know what became of Zipporah's sons. They never led tribes or performed miracles. And still, Zipporah's story remains whole.
Why?
Because her value wasn't tied to her children's fame, her husband's role, or public recognition. She was enough simply because she was faithful. She fulfilled her purpose without needing applause. In a world obsessed with legacy, Zipporah reminds us that obedience is the true inheritance. She was enough in silence, in struggle, and in surrender. Though her name fades from the pages, Zipporah's presence echoes through the story of redemption. Without her, Moses would have died before standing before Pharaoh. Without her, the Exodus might not have begun. She was a guardian of destiny, not through power, but through action. Her decision to act on God's covenant at the inn was the spark that preserved the line of deliverance. Zipporah is proof that redemption doesn't always begin in palaces or pulpits. Sometimes, it begins with a quiet woman in a tent, doing what must be done. Zipporah didn't receive a direct promise from God like Abraham or Sarah. But she stepped into the covenant when it mattered most. In her hands, the act of circumcision wasn't just tradition, it was warfare. She was a covenant keeper in action, not in title. Her hands made holy what Moses had neglected. That is power, the power to intercede, to cover, to protect. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words cut deep. You are a bridegroom of blood to me. Zipporah's strength wasn't in status, it was in sacrifice. Zipporah could have stayed in Midian. She could have remained in her father's house, surrounded by familiarity, safety, and tradition. But she chose a harder road. She followed a fugitive husband toward an unknown destiny. She embraced a people who would never fully accept her. She bore sons in a foreign land and faced dangers no one warned her about.
Why?
Because deep inside, she recognized God's hand. That kind of discernment isn't natural, it's divine. She chose the road of obedience, even when it led through fire, rejection, and silence. There came a time when Moses sent Zipporah and their sons back to Jethro, separating them for an unknown season. Scripture is silent about why, but the emotional pain must have been real. Zipporah had already left her home once for Moses. Now, she was being sent away again from the man she saved, from the mission she helped launch. Sometimes, obedience means stepping back, even when your heart wants to stay. Zipporah bore the pain of distance, not with complaint, but with faith. She knew when to step forward, and when to release. Their reunion came not through tears, but through wisdom. It was Jethro, Zipporah's father, who brought her and the children back to Moses in the wilderness. And in that moment, it wasn't passion that spoke, it was peace. Zipporah returned without bitterness, without accusation. She came because she understood the rhythm of God's plan. Sometimes, love is not loud, it's loyal. In her return, Zipporah showed that reunion doesn't always require a dramatic scene sometimes. It just needs a heart that's willing to obey God over emotions. It's one thing to follow a calling, it's another to let go when the journey demands it. Zipporah had already sacrificed much, but when Moses sent her away, she didn't fight, plead, or resist. She released what she couldn't control. That takes more strength than most realize. Her story teaches us that godly love isn't possessive. It's patient, trusting, and surrendered. In letting go, Zipporah didn't lose her place in God's plan. She honored it. And when the time came, she returned with grace, not resentment. While the world remembers Moses standing before Pharaoh, parting seas, and receiving the commandments, Zipporah remained at the edges, never center stage. But that's where she chose to stay. From the sidelines, she raised sons, prayed in silence, and trusted God's plan even when her name was forgotten. Watching history unfold but never being applauded by it, that's a test of the soul. Zipporah passed that test with grace. She knew that being faithful behind the scenes is no less powerful than standing in the spotlight. Zipporah understood something most never grasp, that God isn't only in thunder and fire. He's in the small acts of courage, the quiet choices, the sacrifices no one sees. She didn't witness the plagues or walk through the Red Sea, but she lived out covenant in a personal way. Her worship wasn't through spectacle, it was through obedience. And in doing so, she reflected a deeper understanding of God's heart, that He cherishes faithfulness more than fame, and obedience more than display. Zipporah was a Midianite, a foreigner to the promise. She had no claim to the covenant by blood. Yet God chose her to be the wife of the deliverer. That's the beauty of God's plan. It's not limited by race, origin, or tradition. Faith opens doors that bloodlines cannot. Zipporah's inclusion in Moses' life is a foreshadowing of the gospel, where outsiders are welcomed and belief is greater than birthright. She may not have been born into Israel, but she became part of its salvation story. She didn't carry a nation in her arms, but she raised the children of the man who did. Zipporah was a mother of influence, not through crowds, but through legacy. She nurtured, protected, and shaped the family of Israel's prophet. Though her name fades from the chapters, her fingerprints remain on the nation's roots. God trusted her with the man who led millions. That alone speaks volumes. Zipporah wasn't just Moses' wife. She was a quiet mother of a people that would change the world. The world saw Moses as a prophet, a leader, a voice of God. But Zipporah saw the man behind the mantle. She held his trembling hands after divine encounters, heard his doubts in the night, and saw him weep when no one else did. She carried his humanity while the world carried his name. That's a sacred burden, to love someone the world only sees as a symbol. Zipporah's role wasn't just about being a wife. It was about being the one place where Moses could be fully human and still fully loved. Unlike other women of the Bible who lived in royal courts or cities, Zipporah belonged to the wilderness. Her strength wasn't built on luxury but survival. She knew how to live where others would faint, raising children in dust, praying through windstorms, and walking miles beside a wandering people. And yet, her story glowed with grace. She didn't need gold or a throne to reflect God's glory. Her life reminds us that holiness isn't reserved for temples. It blooms intense, in silence, in the wild places of obedience. In a generation of miracles and rebellion, of fire and thunder, Zipporah stood firm without ever raising her voice. She didn't challenge leaders or command armies, but she lasted. While many doubted, fell, or rebelled, she endured. That's a different kind of strength. It's not the strength that shakes nations, but the one that holds families together. Zipporah wasn't loud, but she was lasting. And sometimes, heaven counts longevity louder than volume. Long before the Israelites praised Moses or feared God's fire, Zipporah was already in the story. God trusted her when no one else even knew her name. She stepped into covenant, preserved the life of the deliverer, and raised the family of a prophet, all without applause. The lesson? You don't need recognition to be trusted by God. Heaven sees faith before man does. And God entrusted her with sacred things because He saw a heart ready to obey, not impress. Few people in history lived as close to God's direct presence as Zipporah. She walked beside Moses, the man who saw God's glory, and lived under the cloud that guided a nation. But she never sought to steal that glory. Instead, she honored it, respected it, and supported the man God chose without needing to claim a piece for herself. That kind of humility is rare. Zipporah didn't need fire to prove she was chosen. Her life already burned with faith, endurance, and quiet obedience. She was fire without the flame. The Bible doesn't say much about Zipporah after her reunion with Moses. Her name fades, her voice is silent, and her story seems to end. But legacy doesn't always need a final chapter. Zipporah's impact lived on, in her sons, in Moses, and in the unseen strength she poured into the early days of Israel's freedom. Sometimes the greatest legacies are the ones history forgets, but heaven remembers. Zipporah's story reminds us, even when your name is buried in the background, your obedience still echoes into eternity. Zipporah's story joins a long line of women in Scripture whose power was hidden but undeniable, women like Tamar, Ruth, Rahab, and Abigail. Their names are often footnotes, but their impact is foundational. Zipporah stepped into a crisis no one else could solve. She bridged cultures, covenants, and even life and death, all without a pulpit or a prophecy. That's the hidden power of women in God's story. They hold the seams together when everything threatens to unravel. They build futures from the background. Zipporah was one of those women. In our world, we often confuse fame with favor. But Zipporah had no platform, no following, no songs written about her, and yet she was chosen. She was chosen to preserve the life of a prophet, chosen to protect the covenant line, chosen to shape the early home of the deliverer of Israel. That's divine favor, even if the world never applauds it. Zipporah's grace wasn't in her reputation, it was in her role, and she fulfilled it with quiet excellence. She didn't need to be remembered by the world, only by God. Zipporah never asked to be married to the most burdened man in Scripture. She didn't ask to be swept into plagues, deliverance, and wilderness wanderings. But she carried it. She bore the emotional cost of Moses' calling, not out of ambition, but out of love. That's often the truth behind every great leader. Someone else is silently carrying the weight with them. Zipporah's strength wasn't just in what she did, but in what she endured. She carried a calling she didn't choose, and she carried it well. Before the Red Sea parted, before the plagues shook Egypt, before the tablets were carved, there was Zipporah. Quiet, strong, obedient. She was the unseen queen of the Exodus beginning, the woman who made it possible for Moses to fulfill his mission. She didn't part seas, but she stopped death. She didn't lift a staff, but she lifted her family. Without her, Israel's story may have never started. Her name may be whispered, but in God's eyes, it's honored forever. Zipporah was never background. She was the beginning. After her reunion with Moses, Zipporah's name slips from the pages of Scripture. No more speeches. No more acts. Just silence. But that silence wasn't failure, it was obedience. She had played her role in one of the most pivotal stories in history, and she stepped back without needing applause. Sometimes obedience means moving forward, other times it means fading out. Zipporah teaches us that vanishing from the spotlight doesn't mean you vanished from God's favor. Her obedience outlasted her visibility, and heaven remembered her. Moses faced unimaginable pressure, leading a stubborn nation, confronting kings, hearing directly from God. But behind that public power stood a private anchor, Zipporah. She was the calm in his chaos, the home in his wilderness, the only person who knew the man behind the miracles. Every great mission needs an anchor. Without one, even a prophet can drift. Zipporah was never just a support. She was the stability that kept Moses grounded when the storm of leadership raged. She may not have stood on Sinai, but she steadied the man who did. In the wilderness, many rose up in rebellion, even family members like Aaron and Miriam, but not Zipporah. Her name is never linked to complaint, rebellion, or pride. That silence speaks louder than accusation. She walked among a rebellious people, yet kept a loyal spirit. While others crumbled under pressure, Zipporah remained faithful. That kind of consistency is rare, especially when so many fall. She stood apart, not by being louder, but by being steadier. Her faithfulness was her testimony. Zipporah represents every woman whose faithfulness never made headlines. Every mother, wife, or servant who loved God quietly, fiercely, and without recognition. Her story lives in the silent heroines of today, women who raise children, support leaders, and stand in the gap without needing a spotlight. Zipporah's legacy is not in her fame, it's in her reflection. In every life that mirrors her quiet strength, she lives on. God didn't just use her once. He continues using her example as a pattern for quiet faith. No, Zipporah didn't lead the Israelites through the sea or climb Mount Sinai, but she shaped the man who did. She saved him from death, supported him in calling, and raised his sons in covenant. The world often overlooks the ones who prepare the heroes, but heaven doesn't. Zipporah was a maker of deliverers, a molder of history from behind the scenes. In the end, she didn't need to lead millions. She only needed to be faithful to the one man God chose to do so. That was her divine assignment, and she fulfilled it. The night at the inn, when Zipporah saved Moses by circumcising their son, was more than a moment. It was a turning point. From that night forward, Zipporah was marked not just by blood, but by purpose. She had stared death in the face, seen God's wrath up close, and acted with terrifying clarity. That encounter changed her. She wasn't just a wife or a mother anymore. She was a covenant bearer. Her faith didn't just grow, it deepened. Zipporah walked differently from that night on, because once you've stood in the fire of obedience, you're never the same. Imagine living among a people who never fully welcomed you. Zipporah was not Hebrew. She was foreign, a Midianite, and many likely saw her as an outsider. She bore their whispers, their glances, their silence. Though she was married to their leader, she wasn't celebrated like a queen. And yet, she never rebelled. She remained faithful, knowing her value didn't come from their acceptance, but from God's call. Zipporah carried the pain of being misunderstood, but she never let it poison her heart. That is grace under pressure, and only the truly strong carry it. Zipporah was not part of the covenant by birth, yet she was drawn into it by faith. In this, she became a prophetic shadow of what was to come, the Gentiles who would one day believe in the God of Israel. She represents the grafting in, the invitation for outsiders to become heirs. Long before Paul wrote of inclusion, Zipporah lived it. She reminds us that God's kingdom has always been bigger than borders. Through her, the world got a glimpse of the gospel, that faith, not heritage, is the door to grace. For every woman who prays in silence, who loves deeply but is rarely thanked, who supports ministries, families, and callings from the background, Zipporah is your mirror. Her story is not about loud miracles, but quiet power. She carried the cost of covenant in her hands, yet never demanded recognition. Her reward was not in applause, but in alignment with God's will. If you've ever felt invisible in your obedience, remember this. So did Zipporah. And heaven saw her, just like it sees you. We never hear another word from Zipporah after her act of obedience at the inn. No final speech. No farewell. Just silence. And yet, her silence speaks volumes. It tells us that words aren't always needed to preach. Lives can do it better. Zipporah's silence was her sermon. Her actions echoed louder than any phrase. She showed us that some of God's greatest servants leave no quotes behind, only legacies. In the end, Zipporah didn't fade because she was weak. She faded because her mission had already spoken enough. As the Exodus story progressed, Zipporah's absence became more noticeable. But it wasn't the absence of abandonment. It was the mark of completion. She had fulfilled her role. Like a skilled builder who lays the foundation and quietly steps away, Zipporah withdrew when her part was done. Her silence was not emptiness. It was a full stop at the end of a completed mission. In a world obsessed with constant visibility, Zipporah teaches us there's power in stepping aside, especially when your purpose has been fulfilled. Zipporah may have vanished from the spotlight, but she didn't vanish from purpose. She turned her focus to her sons, Gershom and Eleazar, pouring wisdom, heritage, and faith into them. These sons would carry both Midianite and Hebrew blood, and with that, a unique calling. Zipporah's impact continued through them. While Moses led a nation, Zipporah raised the next generation, away from noise, away from fame, but rooted in divine promise. And often, the most powerful work happens in the shadows, not the stage. History may forget her. Scholars may debate her role. But God wrote Zipporah's name in a different place, on the scroll of obedience, in the record of the faithful. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't a prophet. But she was God's chosen for a moment no one else could fill. Heaven often honors those earth overlooks. Zipporah didn't need statues, stories, or songs. Her faithfulness wrote itself into eternity. God keeps better records than history ever will. Zipporah stood between two worlds, the pagan traditions of Midian and the covenant promises of Israel. But she didn't just stand there, she bridged them. Through her, two cultures met. Through her, a family was saved. She carried bloodlines in her womb, but breakthroughs in her spirit. Zipporah is proof that God uses the in-between, the mixed, the unexpected. Her life was a collision of foreignness and faith, and that collision became the birthplace of something holy. She was a woman of both bloodlines and breakthroughs. She never stood on Sinai, never entered the promised land, never split a sea. But Zipporah shaped the deliverance that changed history. She touched Moses' soul when no one else could. She protected the covenant when no one else dared. She lived in tents, walked through dust, and never once needed applause to keep going. Zipporah, the desert woman, didn't just survive, she shaped a legacy. She was the quiet rhythm behind the thunder of Exodus. Without her, the story would have broken before it began. Though no prophet ever declared Zipporah's life as a vision, her story quietly prophesied something powerful, that God's kingdom would include the outsider, that obedience could come from unexpected places, and that the most pivotal acts in redemptive history are often carried out by women history forgets. Her hands fulfilled covenant before the law was given. Her heart bowed to God before the people even knew his name. Zipporah's life was a prophecy, not spoken in words, but lived in sacrifice. And God heard every silent verse of it. Zipporah never built a temple, yet her presence became a sanctuary for Moses. In her tent, the leader found peace. In her arms, the prophet found rest. She didn't need stones, altars, or veils. Her heart was consecrated enough. That's the power of a woman filled with faith. She becomes a refuge in a world full of storms. Zipporah reminds us that sometimes the most sacred spaces are not made of gold. They're made of patience, wisdom, and unwavering loyalty. She was a sanctuary, and Moses returned to her whenever he needed to remember he was still human. We don't know when Zipporah died. We don't know where she was buried. There's no record of her last words or final days. But that doesn't mean she was forgotten. Heaven preserves what history neglects. Every act of love, every step of obedience, every tear shed in silence, it was all written in the book of life. Zipporah's name may not echo in sermons or scrolls, but it is etched in glory. And for every person who feels like their sacrifices have been invisible, remember, God writes where the world refuses to. Some people never know when to speak. Others never learn when to be still. But Zipporah mastered both. She stepped forward when death threatened Moses, and stepped back when his calling required solitude. That balance is rare. She wasn't chasing power, but purpose. Not fame, but faith. Her wisdom lay in knowing when her presence was needed, and when her silence would speak louder. Zipporah lived her calling without ever hijacking someone else's. That's not just humility. That's divine timing. And only a woman who walks with God can live like that. In the end, Zipporah was not just Moses' wife. She was a witness to divine covenant, a witness to transformation, a witness to a man shaped by God's fire. And through her quiet strength, her radical obedience, and her unwavering love, she became part of that transformation too. Zipporah shows us that you don't need to hold the staff to shape the story. Sometimes, standing by the one who does is just as sacred. She was never just a helper, she was a witness. And her testimony lives on in the pages of eternity.